For those of you joining us now, we're just waiting for the link to the YouTube live stream to begin. We'll be starting in just a moment. And here we are. Welcome back to the third day of London Conference 2020. I'm Kate Spiliopoulos, Head of Events at Centre for London. If you'd like to follow the discussion online or look at our very lively poll on London's parks, you can use the hashtag LUNCONF20, that's LONCONF20. If you're in the Zoom webinar with us this afternoon, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to enter questions for the panelists. And I think this session is one that's going to be much more relevant to us than we thought it would be now that we know that we're going into second lockdown. I know over the first period of lockdown, we all spent a lot of time outside in the big local parks that we love, in tiny local green spaces, and just getting as much fresh air and exercise as possible. But as we're a very diverse city, we know that Londoners needs parks and spaces that welcome us all. So now I'd like to welcome our Deputy Director for Centre for London, Richard Brown, to introduce some of the policy aspects of this issue. Richard, I think you're still on mute.
Phrase of the year, you're on mute, I think. Thank you very much, Kate, and welcome all of you to this discussion. Really exciting to be talking about parks, green space and public realm for all. And I think this brings together, as Kate suggested, some of the big themes of the year. London, if you look at it from above, is an incredibly green city. I mean, they talk in New York of Central Park being the green lung. London has green lungs at the end of every street and every street corner. It's a very green city. And over recent years, I think the value attached to the green spaces in London and open space in London has grown. And that's been, in the longer term, that's been because of the city becoming denser, perhaps fewer people having private gardens, more people living in flats, more people having to use the city's public spaces as their living room, as their social space. And over the past 6 months, as Kate said, the COVID crisis has brought it into even sharper focus. For a lot of people, actually getting out into parks, getting out into open spaces has been the way of stopping staring at screens, as we all are at the moment, a way of taking a break from that. So it's become more and more important to more and more people. But we all love our parks, but they can be places of conflict and tension as well. And I think some of those things have also come to the fore. Conflicts can be between different users, between dog walkers and picnickers, for example. They can be between different uses, between use as an amenity for people and use as a pristine habitat. There's also questions, I think, that cut across some of the other issues that we raised this year about who feels welcome. At Centre for London, we did some work with the GLA last year looking at how people use public spaces, particularly privately owned public spaces. And one of the things that came through there is what to some people makes them feel safe, having a very visible stewardship or security presence in a public space, can for other people feel hostile, particularly for some people, perhaps younger people, perhaps people from ethnic minorities, can feel like something that makes them feel much more policed, much less relaxed about using space. So think about how management systems make people feel safe, but also how design of different public spaces actually welcomes and excludes different people. And I suppose another issue that's coming up, and I've seen quite a lot of discussion about in recent days, is as we go into this autumn lockdown and we're talking about darker evenings, who feels safe going out and using public space as the nights are darker? How does that affect women, for example? And how can one actually manage that so that we don't have parks that just work for some people? So a huge range of things to discuss. We've got a great panel. Just to introduce the panel quickly, we're going to hear from Mike Saunders, the CEO and founder of Commonplace, which is, I guess, the right way of describing it, is a platform for a digital platform for bringing people and place together. And he's going to talk a bit about that and what that can tell us about Londoners and their use of public spaces. We have Maria Adebowale-Schwarte, who is Chief Executive of the Foundation for Future London, which I suppose, again, this theme of connection aims to connect the communities around the Olympic Park in East London with the East Bank development, the major cultural and educational centre being built up there. We have also from East Side, we have Mark Camley, who is Executive Director of Parks and Venues at London Legacy Development Corporation, has been there since 2012. Just to declare an interest, I was there as well for the first couple of years of that. And formerly Mark worked at the Royal Park, so someone who has real experience of actually running some of London's big public spaces. And last but not least, we have Shirley Rodrigues, Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy at the Greater London Authority, who addresses so many issues in her portfolio, everything from low emission zones to energy use to parks and biodiversity in public space. So a whole range of interest there. Just before we start, so the format's going to be, we're going to ask people to ask each of the panel members a question, to ask them to share some thoughts, and we're going to see a video as well from Commonplace. And then we'll have a bit more of a discussion and open up to questions from members of the audience. So if you have questions, please put them up on the Q&A or tweet them and we'll get them transferred into the Q&A, or any other comments you want to throw into the chat, and we'll try and make this as interactive as it can be in a digital age. But before we get on to that, we've obviously been, past 24 hours or more have been dominated by one of the biggest exercises in democracy that we know. A big and very controversial political event, democratic event, which has obviously been the World Cup of Parks, which Centre for London has been running on Twitter. I hope you didn't think I was talking about anything else. Now, we've been worrying that it's too close to call, but I could run on with these bad election jokes for ages. But amidst all the allegations that we included the wrong parks initially, that the group system was biased, there was a North London bias, a South London bias, we did get through to the finalists who were put out to the vote today, with a turnout of 1,300 votes, 1,319 votes. We have the Olympic Park and Crystal Palace Park, Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and the Crystal Palace Park as the last two. And the final voting is Olympic Park 34.9%, Crystal Palace Park 65.1%. So that's a result which will no doubt go all the way to the Supreme Court, I suspect. Just before we start, before we move on, I think there's two interesting things about those parks we might come back to. One is, perhaps coincidentally, they're both run through the GLA group. But more interestingly, and not unconnected with that, they're both parks that straddle borough boundaries. And I think from the point of view that they can be seen as places that bring different boroughs together, and perhaps as places to unite communities, might be something we explore later. But at this point, I'm going to turn it to Mike Saunders, and ask him to share his video and some thoughts on what we know about how people use parks in London. Mike.
Thanks so much, Richard. Hi, everybody. So as Richard mentioned, Commonplace is an online engagement platform, and we do focus on connecting people to the places that they live, work or play, with the aim of accelerating positive change. We've had over 2 million people who've used Commonplace, and most of our work is around planning of various different types. So we work with over 200 councils, developers, infrastructure providers. I want to start by showing you a world exclusive of a 60-second film about Park Power, which isn't actually a Commonplace video. It's a collaborative project about London's parks that was coordinated by the London Collective, which is run by Max Farrell. So hopefully we can see that video now.
At a time when parks are so precious and so pressurised, we asked Londoners what they love about them and their ideas for the future. Thousands of people responded. So, what did we learn? We want more nature and quiet places to escape to. And we want to make them easier to get to and to get around. We want to grow food and show our kids how it's grown. With community spaces for different cultures, abilities, and age groups. We can make parks smarter, but tech should be invisible. Using natural materials which are recyclable, all powered by renewable energy. We have now published our research and recommendations for the future, and we'd love to hear what you think. Download the ebook and help us shape the future of our green spaces.
Thank you. So Commonplace was used to collect the 3,500 responses from people. And as you can see, they had a lot to say about what they thought of the future of their green spaces. And there were some really interesting and clear themes that emerged. The first is that people in London love their parks as a form of escape. They value the quiet, the feeling of space, and their access to nature above everything else. They also value the contrast that parks and green spaces provide with the rest of their life. And I think this is probably exacerbated during lockdown and COVID. And an example of that that's interesting to me is they don't really want to work in parks, even during lockdown. What they want is a tonic that's away from the rest of their life. And technology in green spaces where it exists has to be an enabler of these things. People aren't interested in, for example, more Wi-Fi, but they do want to see technology that gives them greater access, creates accessibility and supports sustainability. And people are really also interested in innovation around things like experimental food growing. So as well as these themes, we've been able to analyse clusters of geographic and thematic data to come up with some park typologies, or parkologies, if you pardon the pun. And we're going to be publishing these as part of the Park Power ebook launch next week on the 10th of November, to which you're all invited, along with the exciting ideas about park futures that have been built on this evidence base that we've collected from colleagues at the London Collective, Dar Group and Siemens. And to me, the value of parks doesn't end at their boundaries. And I think it's the context and connection between parks and their neighbourhoods that is so interesting, important and powerful, and I think has really come out during lockdown and COVID. And that link, of course, relates to urban planning, which is the bread and butter of all of the work that we do at Commonplace, pretty much. The 750 projects, 2 million people who've engaged, from housing developments to local plans to low traffic neighbourhoods to energy installations. And as many of you know, planning is undergoing a change at the moment via the government's recent white paper. And whilst this isn't a planning discussion, much of what applies to parks, I think, applies to broader planning too. And I think these proposals offer a great opportunity to get it right for the future. I think it's super important for the public to have a meaningful opportunity to engage with plans, whether they're about parks or housing developments, and for that to be an ongoing conversation, not just episodic one-off surveys. And by doing this, I think there's a real opportunity to ensure that decisions are made around planning with enough community data, that the community collaboration, democratic accountability and trust can be increased, and that all of that can help to reduce friction in the system, and that in itself enables beneficial changes to be delivered more quickly. And I think there's also an interesting role, an important role for developers in creating and enabling green spaces. We're going to hear from Mark about the Olympic Park shortly, and there are other good examples of developments that create or preserve green space. Although I know that green space owned by private organisations is a topic for debate. So in summary, the data that we've collected shows that parks have never been more important, even in the gloom of a new impending lockdown. The renewed enthusiasm and interest of the public is really clear. The context of parks, I think, is essential and fascinating, and getting planning right is absolutely part of the key, I think, for the future of green spaces. And communities have to have a meaningful voice to ensure that we can plan, monitor and adapt these spaces. And that's got to be ongoing, it's got to be holistic, and it's got to be representative of the communities that use them. And of course, digital engagement tools like Commonplace have become more important and more popular during lockdown. And I think they're a really exciting way and part of the solution to help have these conversations inclusively and at scale. And if we can do all of these things, then there's a really exciting future for parks and green spaces and for their role in our communities and cities. And lastly, if you'd like to attend the Park Power launch next week, please do visit parkpowermap.commonplace.is, where you'll be able to see a link to sign up for that. Thanks, Richard.
Brilliant, thank you, Mike. And a lot of really rich research there, and I think people notice the a link to the details of the launch event and the ebook up on the chat, so if you want to pick up on that. Really interesting stuff. Maria, can I turn to you now, please? You've been a long-time advocate of inclusive cities, of placemaking, of how the city is formed. Do you think London's public realm is really open and accessible to all? And what can, particularly at these fractured times, what can the city's public realm do to bring communities together? And what does that mean for people who design and manage parks? Just a few small questions.
Yeah, they're tiny ones. I think London actually should really kind of clap itself on the back. There is still so much more to do. But I guess I'm of the age where I've been to quite a few different cities in different countries. And I think London does pretty well. We have to remind ourselves that we're a national park city. And I think that there is something about Londoners and people who live in London and whatever their background. And I think this is this kind of celebration of culture, cross-culture, and a pride in actually coming from different places from all over the world. I'm not overly romantic. I think every city needs to do more, and that includes London, especially in the time of current C19. I mean, we're talking now, aren't we, about building back better. And I think most importantly is when we're talking about green spaces and grey spaces and blue spaces, it's still making sure that no one gets left behind. And so my job is CEO of the Foundation for Future London. And as you know, that is one of the major fundraising and placemaking funding charities for East Bank. And at the heart of East Bank, which is a new cultural quarter, is the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. Now, I was amazed on the first day that I started at the foundation. I remember walking through the park and just been amazed and actually quite joyful at the diversity, a place where actually the multiple ethnicity, ages, etc. was all seen there in that park. And I don't always see that. However, there's more for us to do. I mean, our vision is that we want a vibrant and inclusive East Bank, and that's about creating authentic engagement with local communities and people. Now, you mentioned earlier that actually East Bank is made up of 4 amazing boroughs, and that's Hackney, Newham, Town Hamlets, and Waltham Forest. And so I think for parks, including the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, is that we have to make sure that the communities and the businesses are involved in co-design around parks. We are at a time, as you said, where we need resilient, inclusive places. So that means co-designing with communities. It means that actually it's not only for planners and architects to create better green spaces. For the foundation, it's about bringing in funding and developing partnerships with funders like Westfield Stratford City and Culture Mile, who actually really invest in creating spaces where people can thrive. And I think that's really important. I mean, the principles for us, as I said, is build back better, cultural quarter that's fit for purpose in this century and the next century. And it has to be about building relationships now and into the future, and making sure we're clear about what that looks like. I mean, for me, I think the really important thing is that we make sure that these hyper-local places like green spaces are actually owned and that people feel safe in them. And that isn't the case in a lot of parks. And at times, I'm sure we would say possibly it isn't the case for some people in the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park as well. So we have to, I think, as an organisation and as people involved with green spaces and inclusive cities, we also have to be always looking at how do we disrupt exclusion around green spaces, and how do we build in equality and eradicate issues that stop people from enjoying or being able to join green spaces. So how do we deal with issues of prejudice, inequality, racism? And they have to be part of our list when we're emboldened to create spaces that actually are fit for purpose. If you look at SDG, it's about making cities, SDG 11, it's about making cities which are inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And so if we're to counter exclusion, then we have to look at all of those things. We have to look at making sure we're bringing economic value. So where are the jobs and training within green spaces and around green spaces? And how do we triangulate? Because actually, if we're looking for a kind of overall city plan, what we're looking for is for brilliant parks like the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park to also be connecting with other green spaces. So we should be developing and designing spaces where a neighbourhood, any individual can walk from one space to another. We talk about 15-minute cities, etc., but I think we can have 15-minute green spaces, green walks. So for us, it's about taking down barriers, it's about funding, and it's also about making sure that we can invest in it. I mean, a big part of Queen Elizabeth Park is the green space, but it's also trying to attract 1.5 million visitors, which we've been doing pretty well on. But for the foundation, it's also about making sure the park is part of a space which can also create jobs. And for that, we have our cultural quarter and our East Bank partners. But that's absolutely crucial that we build and are part of this 1.5 million local economy, which the creative industry does. So to end, I would just say, you know, equalising space is about social, shared spaces, collaborative design. The next one is economy, job security, revitalise neighbourhoods and environment, protection of green spaces and making sure those green spaces are climate change resilient. And finally, because I'm working on arts and creativity with my partners and colleagues, making sure that outdoor spaces have a new role. I mean, here are green spaces and grey spaces that are actually probably the new public artwork and galleries. I mean, just in Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park itself, it has over 20 public art spaces. And I think people are looking for green spaces, but they're also looking for something else to engage them. So into the future, I think we need to do all those things. It's not easy, but it's certainly possible. Relationship building, equitable environments, design, public realm, inclusion, safety.
Brilliant, thank you. Can see some of that public art behind Mark and his backdrop right now, I suppose. So thank you very much, Maria. That's really valuable. We're already getting some good questions into the Q&A, so keep those coming and we'll try and sort of sort them so that we can sort of pull some of them together as much as possible in a few minutes. Mark, can I turn from that, staying around Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park? It's in the middle. Maria was reflecting on one of the most diverse bits of London. This new park spanning several boroughs, biggest new urban park for more than 100 years in London. How's the park's design sought to sort of balance needs and bring different people together and to include everyone? And how has that and its management had to respond to the strange and hopefully not going on for too much longer circumstances of the last 6 months with COVID? Your thoughts?
Thank you, Richard. Well, the park, when we started on the design, actually had a youth panel involved from the very beginning, so that we got the local youths from 4 boroughs involved in the design of the park. We also had a built environment and access panel. So this was people with mobility challenges, so that we built pathways and roads which were safe for people to use and that they could traverse along relatively easily. But we're very fortunate at Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in having actually 2 separate parks. The North Park is a very diverse and biodiverse park. It's built around the waterways, has a green infrastructure which with a flood wall in it, which stops 5,000 homes further south in Canning Town from flooding. And when I took on the park in 2013, I was told it would be a once in 100 years it would flood, and it flooded 10 times in the first year. So it's already proving worth its value. But we also have fantastic playgrounds here, but it's a dark park. And like a lot of parks in London, there's only one route through for cycling in the evening or walking in the evening, lit route. And in a way, it can be feel like a less secure place for some people as a result. And then in the South Park, which has got things like the stadium, the Zaha Hadid Aquatic Centre, the ArcelorMittal Orbit designed by Anish Kapoor. Sorry, my dog's joining us in. We have a lit park, which is open 24 hours a day. And we have, because the games had an infrastructure of security, actually we have CCTV and things so that we can monitor and make the place feel safe for people. Because people want to be able to come into a park, know that they can find their way around it. So things like signage is important. They're looking to see whether there are people working there who they can get reassurance from. They're looking to make sure that litter's cleaned up and there isn't graffiti and things like that. So it's important to maintain to that sort of level. So in designing the South Park, we worked with James Corner Field Operations, who designed the High Line in New York. So a number of the similar features that you would see in New York if you went on the High Line, you would see there. And then around the park itself, we have a number of gardenings, including a mobile garden, which is used to grow fruit and vegetables for the local community, which was in one neighbourhood and has now moved to another neighbourhood as we build out the park and the housing on it. Turning to COVID, I think what we've seen obviously is a drop-off in international visitors, and the park become much more of a local place. And as Maria said, actually reflecting the local communities that we serve and that we're there for. We did some research back in June during the first lockdown, which showed that people had a bigger negative impact on their mental health than their physical health, and particularly for young people or for people who were in multi-aged families living in one domain, and that the park itself provided a great escape for them to be able to get some fresh air, to be able to get out, and particularly when actually there wasn't so much transport going on, actually just getting a less polluted area and so on was all great for people, and getting the physical exercise and so on. And at that time, people said that as a result of it, they would actually be coming and using the park more as part of that survey. And over 70% of East Londoners were recognising Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park as part of the heart of their community and as an asset for London. And it will only continue to be that as long as we continue to reach out and encourage everyone to come in and use it and have a fair share of it.
Great, thank you. And interestingly, seeing some comments already up in the chat, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, about Kelly Clark saying QEOP is one of the few green spaces that feels welcoming after dark, and that she feels happy having a run there. But other people raising issues of how light pollution impacts on wildlife and on green corridors. So on the note of that balancing act, Shirley, the breadth of your work as Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, you must see these arguments from a lot of different angles. Can you say a little bit about what the Mayor's and your vision is for London's parks and green spaces, and perhaps what the Public London Charter is seeking to do to set some standards for how we can all use parks and feel happy with them? Shirley.
Thank you, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Mayor's vision. So from the very beginning, from his election, we'd already, and Maria's already referenced this, espoused the idea of becoming a national park city. And I think the idea was that this wasn't just about increasing the amount of greening in London, but it was really how to make sure that Londoners, all Londoners, were really engaged in their city and were able to enjoy their city. How might we improve the greening of our city, the access to it, but all those other competing, but also integral issues of how do we use our green spaces to provide cool spots, as relief from the impacts of climate change and the sort of increasingly hot summers that we're getting. How do we deal with sort of flash flooding? And Mark talked about that as well at the Olympic Park. So lots of different things. So the main, a couple of main ways, and you're probably all very familiar with this through the new London Plan, setting the policy framework for protection and enhancement. So a number of good, strong policies in there around making sure, for example, that we build in green infrastructure into new developments, because however much we'd like it, and whilst we're blessed with quite a green city, the opportunity for us to create new parks is pretty limited. So how do we actually make sure that we make available on people's doorsteps some pocket parks, green spaces, some sort of opportunity for nature as we can and where we can. So that's sort of one part of it. You mentioned the Public London Charter, and that actually applies to the spaces in between those green spaces. It's really about the sort of public spaces in new developments, and some of those principles about security and sort of access and openness are absolutely critical, and they're probably ones that I think would be quite interesting to explore how they cross over. Some of the things, for example, Mark talked about and Maria about people feeling that they are able to use our parks and green spaces as well as our public realm, and feel that they're not being excluded, or that that it's an opportunity for surveillance or whatever. And then the other piece that I think we really wanted to make really clear is about Londoners' access, and how do we make sure that the sort of areas of deficiency in sort of open or green space or access, that we can help plug that. So we've been doing a lot of work with some of the funding the mayor's put in. So over the last 4 years, we've put in something in the order of about £13 million to support the improvement of and creation of new green spaces. And these are sort of smaller ones, local ones, with community groups, but also some very big ones. You may have seen some of the things that we've done, for example, at Beckenham Place Park, where a former golf course and sort of dog walking spot for probably about 40 people has now become really, opened up into a wild swimming lake and become much more accessible for people, and has been a haven, I think, a sort of fantastic space for people to go to during the last lockdown. And I'm sure that will be true of the one that we're just about to enter, unfortunately. So those are some of the things that we've been doing. But I should also mention the London Green Spaces Commission, which reported, which was commissioned by the mayor to look at how might we support our parks and green spaces. These are mostly run by local authorities whose funding has been hit for many years. It's not a statutory service, which has meant that local authorities have had to really prioritise the funding for them. And to their credit, they have done, but we all know that we are in an increasingly difficult public sector funding regime, where some of those things are going to be, we're going to have to really fight for them to be maintained as havens for us to go there. Two recommendations that came out of that report. One was to create a centre of excellence, and we've been working with London Council's Parks for London and various others to set up that centre of excellence, where we can start to look at sort of best practice sharing and looking at how we might create new funding models to help support that. And the other is a point that Maria flagged as well, is as we are looking to come out of or recover from the COVID-19 and build back better, we are looking to look to see how might we support the green skills, developing new green skills. The environmental and goods and services sector in London is worth about £40 billion worth in terms of sales. That's more than manufacturing and construction, I think, sectors together. And we want to grow that, but it means finding new jobs, new opportunities for people. And we think, this is a key area. So that's just some of the work that the mayor has been doing. And I think I think the last point really is just to flag that the opportunity for parks and green spaces to be an area where people come together, it has actually been somewhere that people are starting to think about now that they're working, at home and sort of wanting to use local areas. Some of the street space plan works where we're reclaiming road space. These are about how do we integrate green space, but has to be community led and community loved, basically. So that's what we're trying to support through the work the mayor's doing.
Great, thank you. Community led and community loved. I like that. We're getting a few questions in now, and also some interesting observations in the chat, some comparisons drawing the comparison between Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and the Crystal Palace, both being legacies of big events. And I suppose the question that was asked about the Olympics is, can we have the legacy without the event, or do the two things have to come together? How can we get the next big pieces of green infrastructure for London? But among the questions, I've got a couple that have come through about the issue of racism in parks, which I think we ought to look at, particularly about underrepresentation of people from Black and minority ethnic communities in parks, and also referring, I think, specifically to some work done by Bridget Snaith about Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and the extent to which that was representing the community. Perhaps I could ask Shirley to give a thought on that first, and I'll come to Mark to talk about QEOP. Shirley, what's your thoughts from a policy perspective on those issues?
From a policy perspective, you know, the mayor has set up with London councils the London Recovery Board, and we've created and agreed 9 missions, and they all overlap. You know, I'm sort of leading one on the Green New Deal, which looks at sort of how might we look at green infrastructure as for jobs and the low carbon economy, but that overlaps with access and inclusion. And you know, that equality, diversity and inclusion approach is absolutely critical. We want to make sure that the parks, green spaces, all the facilities that we have in London are open to all, but we know that that's difficult. So you know, so understanding what people want, what their needs are, and we know that, you know, people use parks and green spaces for different reasons, and we really need to understand that. So some of the work that Commonplace has done has been helpful, but you know, we need to be really careful that we're not listening to the same people who are very engaged in social media and able to use these sort of platforms. We need to be going out, you know, as Maria said, to talk to people and hear what they want from their parks, and we need to understand and design parks. You know, not by the traditional designers, but bringing in the community and co-designing and making space for people to do different things. So it's absolutely a critical issue for the mayor.
Great. Mark, I know we talked about this briefly before, but your thoughts on some of that research about Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, which I thought was interesting in parts. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting piece of research and is certainly thought-provoking. Although I think it's based on quite a small sample time period, but that's not to say that actually we don't have challenges. And I think if we had the Mayor of Newham here, she would be saying she would still like to see a greater representation of people from parts of our borough into the park. And I think there's sort of 4 things I think that we should be doing in terms of improving the diversity of the use of our parks. I think in the first instance, it's sort of touched on by Shirley and Maria, it's about communications and how we communicate. It's about the involvement of different groups and representative groups in design and also in the management, because actually there's still opportunities to change things even once the design's in place. So I think that's an ongoing discussion rather than a one-off piece. I think secondly, one of the things that we've worked hard at is working with local schools and bringing schools into the park, because actually children are a gateway to bring in their parents back to the park and ensuring that you get the local community in through that. Another thing we did on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park when we had a large sports programme in the first 3 years of opening is we hired some route master buses and went down into the far end of Newham, down to Beckton and into Tower Hamlets, and we brought people into the park and then drove them home again at the end of it, so that actually they got to experience the space. And having been there once, we would be able to form a view as to whether it felt safe in a place and welcoming in a place they would like to come back to. And then finally, when I was at the Royal Parks, one of the things that we did when we had, particularly for Muslim women, we did a scheme with local GPs about green prescriptions. About people getting people to walk around the park and so on. And we found that people weren't turning up. And actually what we had to do was buddy up people so that they met up in a place that they were familiar with before they would come into the park, which was unfamiliar to them. And so we worked a programme around that to make sure that people did feel safe coming into a new environment, and one in which actually, if you don't have particularly good signage or lines of sight, it can be quite worrying to come into a park.
That's great, and I've heard some similar things in relation to that work you did in the Royal Parks in relation to younger women, young girls going out in public space, again feeling quite vulnerable if not accompanied, and finding ways of grouping people together. An issue that may be connected to some of these issues I'm going to touch on now is about someone raised the issue about dogs and, to my slight surprise, snakes. That some communities are worried about dogs and snakes in parks. Jackie Meldrum raised this. Is that an issue that's come up? I mean, perhaps be interested to hear whether Mike has any intelligence on that, and then how you sort of look at that, maybe Mark and the Olympic Park. Mike.
I can say with a fairly high degree of certainty that nobody's mentioned snakes. I think, you know, there are obviously, as you mentioned at the beginning, Richard, different communities of people who use parks for very different things. Certainly in the research that we did on Commonplace, we were struck by the level of enthusiasm that the vast majority of people who responded had, and the way that they were kind of adapting their use of parks and green space during COVID, and particularly, as I said, their access to parks as an escape from everything else that's going on, whether that's to walk your dog or to exercise or to you know, just be in those spaces and have a different kind of experience. So I think, you know, I think one of the great things about something like Commonplace and digital tools is that you can use the data to monitor how people are responding and how people are using the spaces, and to adapt over time. And as Mark said, you know, when a park has been designed, and even when it's been delivered, it's not too late to adapt these spaces to different uses. And I think going forward, that sort of flexibility and fleetness of foot is going to be increasingly important for everybody.
Thank you. Mark, I mean, Mark or Mark's dog maybe like have a contribution to this. What's your how have you sought to manage some of these issues in the Olympic Park?
I can say that this summer we did have someone who called us to say that they thought we had some grass snake eggs in the North Park, which upon investigation turned out to be some fungi rather than grass snake eggs. And actually, I did have a complaint, and I'm not making this up, this week about squirrels terrorizing people in the park. But dogs is a real issue, actually, because some people are afraid of dogs and find them an issue. So we have recently identified a place in the park where if people want to take their dog off the lead, that we go and use a particular area, and that we let people know that that's where that's likely to be happening. One of the oddities, because we are split across the 4 boroughs, is actually we've got 6 sets of bylaws. Because we've got a set of bylaws from each of the 4 boroughs, one for Canals and Rivers Trust, because we have the canal and the river going through the park, and one for Lee Valley, who manage the northern part of the park. So there are different rules for dogs. So in the majority of the park, dogs should be in the lead, but not in all of it. But as I said, because of trying to strike the right balance between people who are afraid of dogs, or for religious reasons, actually, if you come into contact with a dog, you have to wash your clothes 9 times before you can wear them again, and prayer and stuff. Then we've identified this area, and we've just started this pilot to see how that works. But that's part of listening to people and looking at the management regime that you've got in place.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to move on from those issues now, perhaps to move on to a bit of a discussion about governance, because I think, Maria, and I'd welcome your thoughts on this, because it's an issue you raised when you were talking. There's a lot of discussion about co-design and co-production now, and I think it's interesting looking at the way that parks and public spaces are managed and looked after in London. And do you think there's a way of actually creating more sort of institutionalized, if that's the right word, community involvement and, you know, more co-production, or should local authorities and public agencies stay in the lead? And you're on mute, I'm afraid.
I think co-production is always crucial. I think you're much more likely to get a place that actually works that way. And I think any one person actually knows how a green space works for another individual or another group or another community. Hence why, you know, there are conversations and questions that you just mentioned that come through around, you know, going into a green space and feeling unwelcomed, or having racist comments at you, or you know, being stared at because you're with your same-sex partner, etc., etc. So I think we have to think about co-design as not something which is fluffy. This is hard-edge politics around design, and it means that people have to come around the table and discuss what's required economically, socially, and for the environment. But it also means that you have a space that works. And to that end, that's really important. I think that co-design has always been around recognising the value of the lived experience, and as one of my colleagues would say, also about knowledge equity. You know, my background is in environmental law and human rights, but I wouldn't sit in a room and expect to be the only person that talks about human rights and their experience. And I think that's the same as planning. If it's about creating public realm that works, that is fit for the future, that can tackle climate change and that doesn't exclude but includes, and as I said before, brings in social and economic value, then the heart of that kind of planning and design process has to be not just around professionals, but with people that live there or have the experience, good and bad, of a green space, a blue space, or grey space. So I think, you know, the ability for humans to kind of evolve is around our ability to sit at a table and co-design almost everything, particularly the spaces we live in.
Great, thank you. Mike, do you want to add anything on that? Because that probably comes into your territory as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would just underline what Maria has so eloquently said about co-design and involving communities. I think the future of neighbourhoods more generally, and particularly of public spaces, absolutely has to have the people who are going to use them at the heart of them. And there's a variety of different ways to include them, but a co-design process which you know, sets out to do that and sets out to involve the community throughout the entire process, I think is absolutely critical to its success. And you know, we've seen in projects that we've done, I'm thinking, for example, of the Mini Holland programme in Waltham Forest, which was a kind of cycling and walking infrastructure project, but created lots of pocket parks as part of that. And there were really interesting uptake of members of the community who volunteered and continue to volunteer to help with the upkeep of those spaces as a result of being engaged in the programme for creating them in the first place and being part of that co-design. So I think it's, you know, it's a great method not only for designing the spaces but also for setting a foundation for people who are actually going to use them as well going forward.
Can I just add one other thing? Sorry, I shouldn't interrupt like that.
No, Maria, then Shirley. Sorry, people talking. This is good.
But I'm just thinking, you know, if we're talking about professionals, it's also about, you know, ordinary people being at the table, but also if we look at the professional sector that's involved in co-design and public realm, I think they've put their flags up, haven't they, most recently, and they've talked about, I mean, if you look at planning and who's in planning, I think public practice are doing a really good job, you know, recognising there's talent out there and they're making sure that it's a very diverse group of people, individuals involved in planning as planners for local boroughs, etc. And then also you have the likes of REBA, you have the Black female architects, all these groups coming together and saying, actually, as professionals, we need to be more inclusive. And I think that also helps to build better green spaces and the kind of infrastructure that Shirley mentioned that we absolutely need in a city like London.
And I have actually seen connected, one of the questions was actually about the diversity or lack of diversity in the green infrastructure workforce in general. So the designers, but also the people on the ground. Shirley, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just going to come in on the sort of co-design, but it's also about the co-management of the space once it's been designed, whether it's a big park or a small local pocket park or whatever. And there is a problem there about capacity and the reliance on volunteers. And I'm very conscious, you know, that a lot of the funding that the Mayor has put out there to support community groups to help develop, improve, create, is reliant on those continued groups or sets of people continuing to be there. And it's one of the things that the Green Spaces Commission, Parks and Green Spaces Commission also looked at. And it's something that we've not really cracked about, that ongoing support. You know, people for various reasons volunteer and then either move away or for personal reasons cannot put as much time in. So how do we make sure there's a core structure there, but still has the local community involved and engaged?
Brilliant, thank you. I'm conscious we're sort of time is ticking on, and there are a lot of questions, and I'm going to try to sort of group them and ask everyone to give some thoughts about the question of, where next for our green spaces in London, I guess. I had a couple of questions about the value of parklets, little very hyper-local bits of green space that people can find, maybe at the end of the block. We've had questions about, picking up the point that was raised earlier, how can we get some more significant size parks, without having to bid for big global events, or even with bidding for big global events? Where are the next generation of parks going to come from? How can we green our streets? And I just mentioned, because I recognise the name from Nicky Gavron from the London Assembly, what about the green belt? Almost every debate in London about housing or anything comes back to the green belt, but how can we make actually that a more valuable piece of green infrastructure? So perhaps I could ask each of the panelists just to give some thoughts on, where next for our public space, and how we can actually, what are the next steps to actually bring more people outside and to make better use of what we've got, and to bring more public spaces along. Mark, Shirley, Maria, Mike, maybe in that order. Mark.
Thank you. Well, three things from me, I think, Richard. So one is, and it sort of touches on a couple of aspects that people have mentioned earlier. One is that I think parks have never been as appreciated as they are now, but they've never been under as much threat. I think the funding threat that will come along because of where we are in the economic cycle and government funding and so on, I think will be a huge challenge for parks. So one of the things that we need to do, as well as thinking about what more we can do, is how we manage what we've got to the right standard. If we want parks to be used, they need to be maintained to a level where people feel safe to come and use them. So that would be my starting point. I think my second point would be, we've seen how low transport neighbourhoods have sprung up during COVID. One of the great pluses, I think, that's come out of the pandemic is how active travel has taken hold. And I think the idea, and I think it might be Maria who touched on it, of actually why don't you have little parklets that join up parks, so that you have this idea of being able to almost always be everywhere's a park. And if you look at somewhere like 880 Cities, are currently running a campaign on 10, 20, 30, which is 10 minutes to a park for everybody by 2030. And they're pushing that as an idea. As well as, I mean, London, again, has become the first national park city. And as through my World Urban Parks directorship, we're working with the National Park City in London to roll that out across the world. And so London's got a lead on actually the world here and globally. And actually, how do we get behind that to make London greener, healthier, and wilder? And then the final thing I'd say is, when we build new developments, actually we should build the green space to go along with it. That needs to be part of the planning. Is how the park has come about. Forget the Olympics. I mean, that helped get the money there. But in fact, what we did and what we're doing is building a city around the park. And that should be a model for having a park at the centre of new developments. And that's how we create the space.
Great, thank you. Shirley, your thoughts on where we can go next in getting better access for everyone to what we've got and getting more in terms of green space?
Well, I think once we've got the new London plan signed off, I mean, obviously we're implementing, but it would be nice, yes, that we could get on with that. But in the meantime, we're obviously trying to apply those principles, and people, many people on this Zoom call and colleagues on the panel, Nicky Gavron, have been instrumental in really pushing for London to really take and place the importance of green spaces and parks at the heart of sort of new development, but also where we can, retrofitting it. I mentioned already that we don't have a huge amount of space that we can create new big parks, just because of the density of London and the makeup of it, and being hemmed in by the green belt. But that's why we're using the new policy of the urban greening factor, for example, to require developers to start to think about where they can incorporate green space and green infrastructure into new developments. But at the same time, the green belt is absolutely critical for us, both as an opportunity to be a sort of, a carbon store, but also providing us spaces for new industries in terms of trees and so on, and the skills that we've been talking about. The Mayor has supported funding of 2 new woodlands out in the green belt, and this is precisely in order so that we can open up access to the green belt for those people who can get there. So how do we link that up with transportation and make sure that where there is little access, or where there is access already to the green belt, that we can improve that and make it, enable more people to get there. But then the London Plan policies are for where we have less access to green space. How do we create new green space? Really, really important.
Great, thank you. And some stuff in the chat there about providing better access to things like golf courses as a way of creating more green space for people, which would be highly controversial. But given that golf is illegal over the next few weeks, perhaps there's an opportunity to sequester. Anyway, I'll shut up on that point and hand over to Maria. Your thoughts on where we go next? And we haven't talked much about East Bank either, I'm afraid, Maria. It would be useful just to get a bit more of an idea of where that project is at and how that's actually connecting with East London as well.
Well, it's the connect to East London is that it's probably the only one cultural quarter in London that specifically has a green space right at the heart of it, and has that heritage around Paralympics and Olympics Park. I think what's really interesting around East Bank, and certainly for the Foundation for Future London, is that it's built around our partners, our East Bank partners, but also very much connected to the local boroughs and co-designed with them. Our role, the Foundation for Future London, is to bring philanthropy and funding into a park and into and supporting local communities. And so for us, for the Foundation, our role for green spaces is making sure we can expand grant making opportunities. If you go to our website, plug Foundation for Future London, you will see all our grants, small, medium and large, with the support of Westfield Stratford City and City of London, talking about public spaces and green spaces, and the thing that I mentioned earlier about triangulating spaces between cultural quarters. I think it's difficult to create new places, but as Mark said, I think whenever we create a new place for people to live, a green space just has to be part of that. And I also agree that the green belt is a space that can't be lost. It needs to be something that connects the city to the outdoors, the belt around it. So philanthropy for green spaces, keep triangulating, making sure we connect people, making sure that we have organisations like the Foundation funding green spaces, and it's not just fashionable, it's absolutely crucial to good philanthropy. And also I would ask people to look at the Future Parks Accelerator programme. Some really interesting work going on in parks, not only in London, though London is wonderful, but also in many other cities, and actually looking at a park as a social, environmental business. How can you create energy? How can you create spaces that people want to go to, etc., etc. Suds the lot. So I think it's worth looking at Future Accelerator as well to see what a future park might look like.
That's really exciting. So looking to the future as well, Mike. We started with your thoughts on the future. We've heard Maria's. What's your thoughts on the future of green space for London in the next minute or minute and a half?
Thanks. Well, yeah, I think I'm really excited by the opportunity to capture and harness this enthusiasm we're seeing from communities for green spaces. I think that engagement has to be ongoing. I think it's really powerful to feed into co-design, and I think it has to be part of the broader thinking about city planning. And of course, I think digital technology has a role to play in that. I do agree with Mark and others who've talked about development being a real opportunity. I think there are some interesting proposals coming forward with big green spaces at the heart of them, less so in London, but in other cities like Manchester, for example. And I think, having communities at the heart of those discussions is really, really critical to make them work. In terms of what's next, well, I would encourage people to come to the Park Power launch next week, where the partners are going to be talking about ideas around zero carbon, well-being, active travel, inclusivity, and culture around green spaces. So do come and join us next week if you can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm going to ask. I think we're going to put up a poll quickly for people who might like to hear more about Commonplace's work and the Park Power research by email. So that poll is going to go up, and you should be able to sign up to that. It will automatically add you to an email list. So please sign up to that if you'd like to. I think that's been a really exciting discussion. It's amazing, and I'm sorry to all the people who've raised questions we haven't even got onto. I think it's amazing and shows how much Londoners love parks, the extent to which people are really engaged in this discussion about how we can make better use of them, how we can really bring communities into the heart of our parks, how we can stop excluding people accidentally or deliberately, and how we can create this idea of parks as a right in a city like London. I really like the idea of 10 minutes to a park by 2030 is a really sort of inspiring sort of idea. And clearly a lot of opportunities to make better use of what we've got, but also to think imaginatively about development processes, other ways that we can bring more parks together. So thank you very much from me to Mike, to Maria, to Shirley and to Mark, and I'll hand back over to Kate, who will talk through what's next.
Yes, thank you so much to everybody watching and all of our speakers today. We really appreciate your being here, and it's so great to think about what the future of London's parks is. I'd like to thank also our sponsors of London Conference. Our major sponsors include the Corporation of the City of London, L&Q, and Uber. Supporting sponsors London Councils, the London Legacy Development Corporation, London Property Alliance, the Greater London Authority, Primera and Trust for London, and exhibitors Commonplace and the Port of London Authority. I can see that although the Twitter poll finished quite a while ago, people are still passionately arguing about it. So if you've got some things to say too, join us at the Zoom networking meeting afterwards. The details should be in your joining instructions from this morning, and we can fight it out there. Later this afternoon, we're going to have a session on what type of homes London needs for the future, given our changing work patterns, changing way people want to spend time in their local neighborhoods and green space. What do we need to do to make sure they have appropriate homes for those things? So that will be at 4 p.m. this afternoon, British time. And we have our first ever London Conference quiz tonight at 7, hosted by Tony Travers and Robert Gordon Clark, and featuring quiz virtuoso Deneen Rowe. So join us all for those things, and I will see you in the networking session. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.